Okay, so if I call up my presentation, this is, I guess, the very broad subject of maximizing the value of content. It's a pretty tricky subject to talk about in just 20 minutes. We've taken a look at 6 pillars of activity at the moment that are going on, just to I guess, focus down on some of the complex issues that are hitting the market. I think we all you hear lots of things about how change is incredibly fast, and also how it's unlikely to ever slow down again. Viewing continues to break up and fragment. I think the only thing that isn't keeping up is the measurement systems to track that viewing. And monetizing the content in today's world is increasingly hard to do. And I think last year, there was an unprecedented amount of activity in all 6 of these areas, not least others as well, but I thought I would narrow it down. We had pretty big mega mergers. Obviously, Disney and Fox caught most of the headlines, unsurprisingly, given its value. But obviously, maybe hitting more of the American market first is the AT&T Time Warner merger. But then others, Discovery and Scripps, Comcast and Sky now, all with very different rationale and reasons behind them, but all having a huge impact on the market. Not just about actual physical mergers or financial mergers, but there's also the different alliances. These are just 4 up here. There are hundreds of very different ones that keep either popping up or for that matter, dissolving. Whether that be ProSieben, the major, one of the biggest commercial free TV broadcasters in Europe, with their activity with Discovery in Germany, whether that be our friends at the BBC and ITV with their imminent or maybe not imminent, but soon launch of BritBox in the UK, which has launched in the US. There are ones in every market, and I guess one of the biggest challenges we face is actually looking at when we look at the prospects of all of them, how to value what the likely success is going to be. And undoubtedly, something like BritBox has got a huge amount of potential in the UK, but it's also got a huge opportunity cost. Salto was hugely heralded by the French Culture Ministry and lots of people in France about how they'll get together, the commercial and the public broadcast will get together, and they'll make a big difference to the French market. But actually, when I've talked to people in France and people who work for those organizations, they actually don't really like each other and are not really convinced it's going to work. So, and then Paravi is just one example in Asia and Japan, where there's a very significant, large, multifaceted media organizations are involved in that business. So by all accounts, it should have a lot of strength behind it, but I guess the problem is that they're all still doing their own thing. They're not putting everything into that venture. They're still all running their original services. Direct-to-consumer, it's interesting because it's such a big topic. There's been so much going on, maybe kind of fueled a lot by Disney Plus and other things. But in reality, direct-to-consumer has been going on for years, whether it's been content owners launching channels or launching other services. One way or another, they've been involved. But they're happening at a different scale and a different rate. They all come with different challenges and different issues. But with Disney launching, I think, actually next month, I think is expected in the Netherlands. It's going to be interesting to see the dynamics of how they launch, how they then relate with the other businesses in that market, not just what they do themselves, OTT, but how their relationships change and evolve with the other distribution platforms in the market. And not least because of Apple's keynote, which some of you may have sat through the day before yesterday, the whole new generation and new players who are being aggregated in the market and how that market is changing is again going to be a big issue in 2019 and is again going to impact how people can maximize the value of their content. Amazon Channels is just one of those. On the left is the chart that shows the growth of the number of channels available in the US on Amazon Channels. Actually, it's as you can see, it's plateaued over the last few quarters, and in fact, slightly dropped. I'm not sure yet whether there's much to read into that, other than I think, from what I understand, they have quite a few technological challenges around that platform in the US, and it is heavily populated with a lot of I would politely say, marginal channels and marginal content. But they've been launched in the UK, Germany, Japan, and I think we understand France and India and some other markets are imminent as well. And those channel services, channel volumes, lower, but growing to some extent. But we'll see how Amazon evolve that. But I don't know who of you went through the details of this, but obviously Apple did a hugely stylistic and slightly lack of substance session on the world, telling us all about Apple TV Plus, their subscription service, but not really telling us much at all about it. But there were some interesting things in there, in the way they're talking about being more agnostic about hardware. I think their tie-up with Amazon is probably the most significant in terms of sort of burying hatchets. But interesting, launching Arcade, their subscription gaming service. I think the only thing, other than maybe some of the interesting things around their credit card service, where they actually positively said what they were doing, was their change to the News Plus service, which they are offering. They've announced what the pricing is, and also for people who have Apple hardware, it's a different proposition. The pricing model is different. So even though they haven't said anything about the SVOD service, you can maybe start reading into some of those things about what they might start doing with it. But the other subject, for us in our business, we travel around EMEA and a bit broader sometimes with clients in lots of different areas. And it's interesting that I would say, actually looking at that timeline, I would say 5 years ago, AVOD was a dirty word to content owners. They considered it to be the plague of Russia or China, and they didn't want to license to it, and they didn't want to get involved. That has changed radically over the last few years, largely because you can see through this slide the evolution of the people who are involved. We've seen kind of major companies kind of launching services. We've seen companies like Pluto most recently been bought by Viacom. We've seen Sinclair launch their service in the US. Roku's growth has been phenomenal, really. They're not so much their hardware growth, but if you look at their what they call their platform revenues, that is the massive majority of their revenues now, and it is growing fast. And this is an area where we know content owners are much more open in many territories to deal and to work. Obviously, there are still issues around them getting over the concerns around, they always viewed SVOD revenues as being incremental. They're worried that AVOD revenues are more substitutional. But they're getting over that, and we'll see how that changes. There's many a chart you could put up for the challenges of pay TV. This is just one short one, just illustrating in the US kind of the challenges they're facing and how kind of virtual pay TV is not, I wouldn't say it's seen as a great white hope or anything, but obviously it's been growing, but it is still a relatively small part of the economy, and it is still not filling the gap in terms of what's leaving traditional pay TV. And you just have to look at AT&T's numbers to see actually how big the problem is for them. The left chart's probably the easiest one to look at, with the red being the losses of their satellite DirecTV customers, and the pink being the growth of their DirecTV Now customers, which had a pretty bad quarter at the end of the year. But you can see even before the disastrous final quarter of the year, actually kind of it was a challenging environment in terms of what they were doing, especially when you consider DirecTV Now as a much lower ARPU product. And pay TV are kind of rapidly trying to find out ways to fit in both with new products, but also with how to fit in with all these new relationships. And we certainly feel that this year is going to see, well, we hope it's going to see some very imaginative new relationships with pay TV operators. They may just evolve slightly, and they may just be fairly normal and boring relationships that maybe don't motivate people to market and sell services, but we'll see. But wherever you look, Netflix is on more boxes or heavily more integrated into boxes, or even more integrated into pricing, as with Sky. Stars is now on the Virgin box here. TNT in Sweden has now completely evolved, shut their linear channel, and they're now an on-demand service bundled with the pay TV operators. There are all sorts of different relationships. And Experimentation Flex is just one of many. There's Now TV over here, one of the new approaches pay TV is making towards addressing consumers and dealing with these issues. Maybe this is more of a, when you hear what they say, they're talking about different segments. Maybe they're talking about targeting Generation Z or millennials. But if we just get to the content now, this competition and this market is massively driving the production of content. There's a lot of chat around whether there's a bubble that's going to burst, whether there's too much, what's going to happen. But on the left is the amount of US productions, original series productions each year, and you can clearly see from the red line it's been driven by the SVOD players. It's been driven by Hulu, Netflix, and Amazon. If you look at the chart in the middle, that's actually their originals, which is slightly different to that number, which that includes their international originals and co-productions, showing again that those have been grappling over the years. But it's not just SVOD. It is the pay TV players, and it's also others and other groups who are kind of investing more in original production, investing more in terms of volume and more in terms of individual productions. With Nent, the Nordic Entertainment Group, they are somewhere between 50 and 20 series each year. Sky had, I think, 15 last year, and Movistar are expecting to have 14 this year. They're not alone. It's interesting, all over they'll pop up. Deutsche Telekom in Germany, they've made originals. Telenet in Belgium. There's everywhere. There's people popping up. And the budgets are still going crazy. If you talk to people in the production community, you'll sit there and you'll wish you were a talented writer, because you'd be earning a lot of money right now. There is so much demand for talent. This doesn't even say it. We talk to people about how kind of studios are blocked out for 5 years to come. There's no space. And what this chart really shows, apart from showing the kind of the usual game of how expensive it costs to make per hour a show, it shows how it's moving. So to some extent, the greys up there have always had big vanity productions, big numbers that went up the top there. HBO even did older ones like Rome and things like that were huge value. And they always blew that kind of $4 million mark in the US. And it's SVOD that have suddenly started coming in and kind of fueling that market and fueling those premium budgets. But also, probably more importantly, is the yellows and the greens. So the yellows are the pay TV operators. They're the Skies, there's the Rookies, the Liberties co-production with Stars. Picnic at Hang Rock was a Foxtel in Australia with Fremantle. Those are up at levels unprecedented for pay TV operators to invest in programming. And then also shows like Vanity Fair, The Night Manager, War of the Worlds. Those are also kind of co-productions that have been put together with domestic broadcasters plus SVOD, or plus a US broadcaster, or plus some financing that's come that's enabled those shows to hit those higher levels. And as a result, there are a great deal of different relationships out there, whether it's the BBC making things with HBO or Amazon, whether it's the Middle Eastern broadcaster NBC with their Turkish studio making something with Netflix, with The Protector, whether it's Sky or Yes Studios in Israel making shows. They're all combining up with different combinations that share territories, that share windows, that share rights, that make that kind of checkerboard of finance that makes these projects work much more complex. But behind all of this, there is still an economy of people buying TV shows. Just based on the last 2 seasons of US TV series, this is the number of services that are effectively licensing shows in each market. So if you're selling into the UK, 32 individual services bought content. That would have included a Netflix and Amazon, but it also includes the Sky services, the Channel 4s, the ITVs, the BBCs, and the Virgin Medias for their on-demand. There is a very broad and varied kind of ecosystem buying them. And they're still buying them. So this is built on TV seasons. Red is the 16-17 US TV season. Blue is the 17-18 season. And in the UK, for example, 79% of all of the shows that came out of the US in 2016 were sold. That shows how vibrant and how big that market is. Maybe it also shows that 21% weren't, and there's stuff that wasn't sold, but it shows there is still a big market out there for programming. And if you look at all those different markets, you can see how diverse and different the markets are, which I think talks also to how anyone could have a kind of a global strategy for their products. But if you look at somewhere like Sweden and the Nordics, it's almost entirely an SVOD market for premiering new scripted TV shows, thanks to the existence of Viaplay, HBO Nordics, Netflix, to a lesser extent there Amazon, but also Seymour, which has SVOD-only content. They're buying most of the products in their market. Some markets like Australia, although having vibrant SVOD players, they're still buying a lot for free TV. So these markets are still there, but en masse, on average, SVOD is edging up in terms of its buying. And if you look at how the Windows content is first hitting a market, in each and every one of those markets, there's a little blip in maybe in Australia statistically, a bit of an anomaly, but they're more of those first windows are going to on-demand. And just the logos are down at the bottom, just to reiterate that this isn't just about Netflix and Amazon. This is about broadcasters launching adjacent digital services that are exclusively on demand. I'm not talking about catch-up services. And this is about local players and local operations and regional as well. And this is kind of key to one of the points that we'll finally end up wrapping up with around the monetization. In broadcaster terms, what this is showing you really is that in terms of free TV and pay TV, both of those broadcasters are doing much more with the content when they license it. This is critically important to how people monetize content and value it, because you want to sell it more than once, and you want to get the best deal in the market. And if you do that, it used to be simpler to figure that out and to work out how you're going to do that. Now, how the show gets used matters, and the broadcasters are using as much leverage as they can and negotiating much harder and getting more right. So when I say enhanced catch-up, that means either in-season stacking, or they dropped a whole box set at premiere, or they maybe drop a box set exclusively. And there's been, as you can see from the 18, 19 season shows, which actually have still got a long way to go in terms of their sales cycle, in terms of where they go internationally. There have been a huge growth there with free TV. And you can see just here, I mean, this is some fairly, I say primitive numbers from Barb in terms of how some shows have been watched. So what this tells you is with Killing Eve, which was dropped as a box set on release, in terms of the first 4 episodes that were released, 37% of the viewing of that episode was done on demand, not in a catch-up window, was done on demand as a box set before it aired on linear. And with Tin Star, the number was 52%. That's on Sky. Actually, that's an average number. And if you look at the 5th and 6th episode, it's well over 60% for Tin Star, and I think it's up to about 50 for Killing Eve. And there is sort of massive examples. We'll just chuck 8 up here. There's just 8 from 8 different markets, just showing how, whether it's pay TV or free TV. So you've got SVT, who are pretty much following the BBC line, where they're a public broadcaster. They're dropping full box sets. You've got SBS, who are pretty much similar to Channel 4 over here. They're doing the same as well. It's definitely growing. And just to kind of just to close shortly, the second window issue is a big issue for people monetizing content. In a really simplistic way, in talking about it, you could say if someone's working out a project, deciding whether they're going to greenlight a show, okay, 25% of what they put in their numbers is coming in 3 years' time, roughly, and is coming in a second window. Okay. So if you're the financial controller or you're the person stacking out that project, you can do that. Now, people don't know what to put in there, because they're putting more values in the first window. And on top of that, when SVOD takes the first window, it changes the equation entirely, because there's a lot of broadcasters who are frankly kind of scared of taking a show after SVOD. That is going to be a really interesting year for that, because there's a lot of shows coming out of SVOD and being licensed. It is happening. So what this chart shows you, slightly complicated, is that in the inner circle shows you kind of where the first window went. So half of the shows overall went to pay TV, 21% to SVOD, and 28% went to free TV. But then if you look at the second window, so of those shows, most of those second windows go to SVOD. So 38% there following pay TV. So SVOD has more traditionally been taking the second window, because it can live with that. It wants the first window, but it can live with that. But the split following SVOD is fairly even at the moment between free, pay, and then going again to SVOD, because the dynamics are very different. And if you look by market, you can see how different they are. actually in Germany at the moment, there's an interesting amount of kind of activity by RTL and by a few other broadcasters who are following SVOD. And if you talk to, not specifically them, if you talk to broadcasters, they will still tell you this is an experimentation. We know there's shows, though, we know Riverdale was broadcast here on Channel 5 after Netflix. It bombed. It did dreadfully for Channel 5. They had found no audience for it whatsoever. It was dreadful. But they did the same with, I think it was it Taken, I think maybe, and that was a big success. The Sinner was on BBC 4 following Netflix. That found an audience, very different audience. It did very well. So people have still got a lot to learn. And this is just a few examples that I won't dwell on of how that is. And you see interesting things. So in Sweden, you see Netflix following other SVOD. You see, in some cases, free TV following SVOD, and the other way around. There is a very fluid environment for this at the moment, and for salespeople, it's very tricky to kind of to zoom down on what could possibly happen. And I think they're still being surprised by opportunities that come their way. That's it for me. I'll just wrap up briefly. I mean, from our point of view, kind of these are just a few of the things happening, but obviously consumption patterns and expectations of consumers have just changed radically. And I think for us, a lot of this change now, it's not edge case anymore. This is not a small bit of the business case. This is a big bit of it, and it's increasingly important. And we've seen a huge amount of pace in terms of channels and pay TV operators innovating, but they are having to balance the traditional revenues, their costs, their opportunity costs from doing all of these things. And this transition is difficult. It's very hard. But you have to kind of, if you look back, remember Netflix? I mean, okay, maybe they haven't pulled a profit, but when they launched streaming, they annihilated their DVD business. They freely annihilated the most profitable part of their business and destroyed it. And it was delivering them so much cash. And they did it. But it's easier for them to do that. But there's a great market out there for programming, and there's lots of different rationale for the productions going on. But I've said enough, so it's time for me to call up our next speaker. I mean, we could take, I think we've probably just got a little bit of time for questions, if there are any now. If not, we can take them afterwards in the session.